Good morning. Bill Colley here. I'm making what you might call a rather unusual Sunday appearance in our studio, but only because there were a couple of things I wanted to quickly update you on as we get into next week. And there are going to be so many. Let me be honest. In this day and age, we are looking at a news cycle that is just so chock full. Maybe it's because we're watching the empire melt down, but it's so chock full of news, whether it be political news, news about any other event going on in government, failure of bureaucracy, as well as what we are still fighting, the culture wars. And I think that all of these things have to come into play here. And sometimes we almost need a 7-day-a-week addressing of it. So what I wanted to do was sit down this morning and just talk to you briefly about something that happened over the weekend. And I think it's going to have great bearing on the upcoming 2016 elections in this country. Although we always say the latest cycle is the most important we've ever had, it does seem that the reason we keep coming back to that is because perhaps it is, as things just seem to be getting worse and worse and worse. First of all, Donald Trump. A lot of hot water this weekend because he supposedly said John McCain was not a war hero. Can I share a couple of things with you about this and my perspective on it and all of that? About 10 years ago, I was hosting a radio program, and this was during the height of the war in Iraq. And you had a lot of people, obviously, who were torn about that war, and many people who were opposed, including some people who had actually worn a military uniform at one time or another, some who had actually fought in previous wars. And I was interviewing a friend of mine. He was a young Army officer, and we were talking about some of these people who obviously have some issues. And he said, look, after Saratoga, maybe I have to put a little context in here because Saratoga, that was a battle in the Revolutionary War. Some of you public school graduates may not still know that. There was a man who was the hero of that battle, and he was badly wounded. His name was Benedict Arnold. And at that point, Benedict Arnold was the biggest name in America, the grandest hero of the Revolutionary War. We all know the story of Benedict Arnold from another perspective, and that is Benedict Arnold eventually sold his country down the river, and his name now is synonymous with being a traitor. So a friend of mine mentioned that. He said a lot of the people that we're dealing with right now, who are making so much noise about this war and trying to interfere with the conduct of it, he said, remember that. They may have been heroic people at one time. That doesn't mean they're heroes today. Now, I get to this context about John McCain, who, let me be honest and upfront, a lot of conservatives and even a lot of people who may be moderate Republicans have felt John McCain over the last 15 years, perhaps even longer, has been a huge disappointment politically. When McCain first came to Washington as an elected member of Congress, he was actually quite close to President Ronald Reagan. Then there has been a drift in the last 30 years since then, and McCain has often jokingly been referred to as a Democrat. In fact, I remember reading a column in Parade magazine some years ago where the writer actually said that. McCain is praised by media, liberal media, because he's one of them. That is, until he was running for president in 2008, and media found an even bigger hero of its own, and then all of a sudden McCain was a bad guy. John McCain, when it comes to American media, he's a man, well, for its purposes, when they need him, he's a hero. When they don't need him, in fact, they prefer someone else, he isn't. So we understand that. So now they're all suddenly jumping up and down saying he is a hero because Donald Trump said he wasn't. And because we don't like Donald Trump and we hate him even more, therefore John McCain now is our good guy. And we told you about Trump all along, and you people you are so misguided, you need to listen to our counsel, and you're not doing it. And we're telling you who to vote for next year, and you're not following the script. This morning, a friend of mine sent me this. This is a bit of work from Cheryl Atkinson. Now, you may be familiar with her name. She worked at CBS News for a long time and had a falling out because, of course, the place is so blatantly liberal, and she decided she needed to start speaking the truth. I'm a veteran of radio, television news, and even some print media at one time, but let me tell you something. She's spot on, and it's getting even more liberal. Well, let's put it this way. It's gone beyond that. Far left-leaning. Media, for the most part in this country, has just gone down that path. They don't like to be reminded of it because they don't want you to know what is actually going on. Atkinson is writing about this exchange that Donald Trump is now being raked over the coals for. And let me take a moment just to give you a little bit about what she's saying. An article in the Washington Post is headlined, Trump slams McCain for being captured in Vietnam. Never mind that a lot of people who actually served with John McCain say that he was a terrible pilot, and that when he was shot down, he failed to take evasive maneuvers. And he even admits in one of his books that he was a terrible pilot, a terrible student, and very undisciplined as a member of the U.S. Navy. So let's just put all that for to the side for the moment. The article's lead sentence states Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump slammed John McCain, a decorated Vietnam War veteran, on Saturday by saying McCain was not a war hero because he was captured by the North Vietnamese. Atkinson asks, is this accurate? Well, she says in Trump's actual quote, the opposite of what is presented in the Post first sentence is what happened. And she goes on to say this. Number one, the Post did not provide context at the outset that discloses that both Trump and McCain have been feuding in recent weeks. The Post is accurate, number two, in reporting that Trump initially said McCain is not a war hero, but then Trump immediately modified the statement saying 4 times that McCain was a war hero. Now remember, Trump is speaking without a script. He doesn't have political handlers who rehearse him on everything that he says. Number three, did Trump say McCain is not a war hero because he was captured? No, she writes, not in the exchanges represented in the Post. Number four, is the Post characterization then an accident, she's asking? And she goes on to say, no, it's not. The Post might have been able, she writes, to get away with stating Trump implied McCain. And of course, when you say implied, you're saying you're in somebody's head, and reporters can't actually get in your head. Nobody can actually get into your head. Implied McCain was not a war hero because McCain was captured, but even that would have been a subjective interpretation since Trump had actually stated the opposite. She goes on to say it's true that Trump stated 1 time that McCain is not a war hero, but he stated 4 times that McCain is a war hero and that he was not accurately characterized in that article, or his statement was not accurately characterized. She says the news media, and this part I think you have to really remember, every time you watch a TV newscast, you read a newspaper, especially the op-ed pages, but really that's become the front page too as well. Every time you read it, be suspicious. You have to be. And she says, news media has a responsibility to do its best to report accurately and fairly, even when reporters find a candidate and or his positions to be personally distasteful. So I think she's pretty well nailed it right here. I don't like Donald Trump, therefore I am going to do everything I can to destroy Donald Trump so that I can give you the candidate I think we need. See, they're not really worried about what you think. There's a bit more to all of this. While doing some research this morning for Monday Morning Show, I came across this. This is from Pittsburgh Tribune. I guess that's what it's called, the Trib. A friend of mine turned me on to this, by the way, because he is a native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Speaking of military officers, he was a Navy officer for many, many years, and he's heavily involved in the Korean War Veterans of America. I should point out he's also not fond of John McCain. How does that work? Well, all right. A writer by the name of Selena Zito is writing at this newspaper. I printed this up this morning. She says, it is always remarkable to witness experts not understanding the field in which they are experts. Even more remarkable, she writes, they still do not recognize the frustration of the masses, despite the unsettling wave elections of 2006, 2008, 2010, and 2014 that vividly affirmed populist movements against both political parties' establishments. And then she goes on to mention it's not just Donald Trump who's getting a lot of attention on the right. Look at Bernie Sanders. Why is that happening? What is he tapping into? Did he even intentionally plan to tap into it? Probably not. Bernie Sanders didn't expect to have 10,000 people come out and greet him when he was out campaigning. He seems a little bit overwhelmed by all of that, too. His opponents should be, but apparently they're not. And they just look at him as being someone who will eventually go away, and most likely he will. But the fact of the matter is, somebody's missing something here. Donald Trump has said he expected to be, when he was campaigning initially, he told a reporter this, he expected to be the jobs candidate. He never expected to be the candidate when it came to illegal immigration and suggesting we were going to build a wall and some of the other options that he has suggested along the southern border. He expected that because of his background in business, he was going to talk about how we create jobs. But he tapped into something unexpectedly. Now, the columnist at the Pittsburgh Tribune goes on to write, if you are not out here, outside Washington, outside of the coastal elites, you are overwhelmed by the incompetency. If you are inside, she said, you don't understand what's going on. Inside the Beltway, all they do is they talk in the bubble, which has become an echo chamber, and they really have no idea. What happens is they'll send a reporter during a campaign out to Nebraska. The reporter will end up coming into a town, especially if it's a TV reporter. They actually have a producer who does most of the reporting. The big network types, they're just there to smile and look good on camera and read what someone else writes for them. And they go into a diner and they sit down and they talk to a few people. They find one selective person, and it's anecdotal evidence. It's not necessarily the feelings of everybody in town. And that person will tell you, well, I don't like candidate so-and-so. And then they say, wow, here's a Republican who doesn't like the Republican leadership or the Republican candidates. Has it ever occurred to these people that there might be people who they talk to in the diners who just want to shoo them away and will tell them anything they want to hear? So they don't get an accurate reading of what's really going on in this country. People, according to Selena Zito in Pittsburgh, are upset about bureaucratic bungling that results in China stealing all of our secrets, whether they be business secrets or the records of government workers. Tens of millions of Americans, they now have the records. Or are you upset because the VA system can't treat the real heroes of this country who desperately need their help and are dying in many cases while they're waiting for treatment? Are they upset because the economy just continues to be sluggish and doesn't seem to be moving along? Or because the government tells us that this deal with Iran is great when it obviously isn't? Well, it's the best we could do. Aren't we supposed to be the most powerful country in the world? I think that hasn't changed. It may be diminished, but it hasn't changed. So why is it the best deal that we could get? All of these things play into this. And over on the left, you have many similar gripes just from the opposite end of that prism. She has this: populism is lightning in a bottle. It's always bottom up, and it's always about people looking for a leader, not a circus barker leading a parade of tigers and jugglers on a small-town promenade. Now, she also says Donald Trump simply is not going to be president of the United States. Bernie Sanders is not going to be president of the United States. Agreed on both counts. But I'm going to tell you, if somebody else in this political milieu would suddenly stand up and realize what people really feel, they're going to end up making some great strides. Unfortunately, we just get Casper milquetoast on both sides. Where will it end? Look, there's a long time between now and November of 2016. You'd think that we might have time to turn things around. I'm a skeptic, and I'm a pessimist. On the other hand, when this country has always needed a leader, they come out of nowhere. George Washington had been a rather middling officer during the French and Indian War, and one of the great biographers of him once said, he learned as he went along. He lost a lot of initial battles in the Revolutionary War, but he was always learning from his experiences and ended up becoming victorious in the end. 80 years later, a guy named Abraham Lincoln shows up on the scene. Up until that time, a loser in politics and pretty much a loser in many aspects of his life. But he saved the Union. 80 years later, Franklin Roosevelt, a man who has been crippled by disease, brings us through a Great Depression, probably not really brings us through it as much as just sort of holds our hand while it continues and doesn't really get any better. But then suddenly, when faced with the crisis of a world war, he was a spectacular leader in that sense. You also understand these things come along in 80-year increments. Lincoln comes along 80 years after Washington. Roosevelt essentially, roughly, comes along 80 years after Lincoln. And wouldn't you know, 2020 or so, we're 80 years after Franklin Roosevelt. We may still be in the wilderness for another 5 or 6 years. But on the other hand, if like clockwork, this thing just keeps repeating in cycles, we're going to find someone, eventually, somehow. Just God pray that we all survive until we get to that point. I want to thank you for joining me on a Sunday morning. I don't normally do this, but I felt it was important enough to pop in and say a few words about it, share my thoughts with you, and help set up things for the coming week. Have a great Sunday, and, being a day of worship, say those prayers for not only yourself and your friends, your loved ones, but your country as well. God bless.